Honors at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. During this 25-26 academic year, she's also a visiting fellow at the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton University. Her research has focused on the politics and economics of trade, global production, and automation, with an emphasis on economic well-being and political influence of workers and firms. She's previously held appointments at Texas A&M University and the University of Zurich. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Erica Owen.
Shall I take it away? Okay. Thank you so much, Binur, and for this invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Tracy and team, for helping organize, and thank you, Provost Olson, for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen and we can get started. There we go. Great. So I think everyone should be able to see my screen, but let me know if there's any issue. Great. So thank you again for being here. I'm really excited to be talking to you about this topic. As mentioned, there's a little bit of an echo. I don't know if it's me, but really excited to be talking to you about U.S. trade policy with a focus on tariffs, trade wars, and jobs. As I'm sure you're aware, trade has been constantly in the news. Two of the headlines that I have here are from today. It's been a really salient issue in the last few elections. And so what I want to try and talk about today is sort of what is trade, why do we do it, and how can we understand where we are today in terms of trade politics? So we're on Zoom, so I won't ask you to say this out loud, but maybe just take a moment and think about, what are the things that you use every day that are a product of trade? And so here's just like a couple of examples of things that we come in contact with every day. Tracy, do you have a question? That we come in contact with every day that are a product of trade, right? So especially things like electronics and other things that we use in school. The US gets a lot of products through international trade. However, trade today is quite different than how it used to be, right? So in other words, the nature of trade has changed in really significant ways that drive trade policy and trade politics today. So goods today are produced across multiple countries. Like here we have like a very simplistic view of an iPhone that gets parts from many different places and then is assembled in a place like China and shipped back to the United States. So firms are trading not just goods, but also parts, materials, and services. There's a huge role for multinational firms in international trade. They have built these complex global production networks. And like a really key and politically salient piece of this is offshoring. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But so when I talk about trade, I don't just mean the ship or the container full of finished goods. I'm talking about this web of production that starts with design, goes through like the parts, the assembly, and then how it reaches consumers in different places. Trade has, just as sort of like a last bit of like motivation here, trade has very wide-ranging impacts. We focus a lot on trade and jobs. That's a big narrative in the US and other advanced economies. And it's going to be a focus of my talk today, but just at the outset, let's think about for a moment the way in which trade impacts us, sort of from like the most micro level as a consumer. We benefit from trade through lower prices and more variety. Trade affects us as workers. For some workers, we'll talk about it creates lots of opportunities, and for other workers, It creates dislocation and negative labor market outcomes. The same can be said of companies and industries. Some really benefit and some are harmed by global competition. Communities are a really important sort of locus of thinking about the benefits and especially the costs of global competition and how that shapes the policy and political debates that we're having. And very lastly, I'm going to focus on the US piece of this in the talk, but trade has really been viewed as an engine since post World War II, been viewed as an engine that has been an engine of economic growth. It has lifted people out of poverty, especially in emerging markets, but it has also widened gaps. It's generated more inequality between countries and across countries. And so we can think about sort of a variety of different levels at which trade impacts us, and these have important political consequences. So, as mentioned at the outset, today I'm going to talk about why do countries trade? So I want to set a foundation for why do economists think trade is good? How has that sort of driven US trade policy? And then think about why is trade contested? So setting the foundation is a little bit of sort of background and intuition. And then we'll get into US politics and policy. How did we get to the moment that we're in today? So we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of trade policy, and then what do we expect to see in the future? What are some of the potential policy impacts that we're likely to see? And I want to mention, because of the way I have my screen set up, I can't see you. So if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand, or if there's an issue at all, just let me know. So, okay, first, why do countries trade? And so if you can bear with me for a couple of minutes, we'll do a little bit of a high-level discussion around why do countries trade based in sort of canonical or traditional economic theory. So in a world of no trade, that's what we call autarky, a world of no trade, countries can only consume what they produce. And so in simple terms, in a world without trade, that means no coffee for many countries who don't have the climate to grow coffee, right? A very sad world, in my opinion, right? So countries differ in terms of the amount of capital that they have, in the amount and the skill level of labor that they have, and in terms of the resources that they have, whether that's natural resources like petroleum, whether that's land or minerals, etc. When we think about these different strengths, what economic theory shows us is that those different strengths can lead to shared gains. If countries specialize, and I'll talk about, sort of what that means in a few minutes here, but if countries specialized in what they did best, and then they engaged in trade, both countries could be better off. So this is a very simple example, just like a toy example to help us think about the intuition that drives why countries benefit from trade. So if you just imagined a very simple world with two countries, the US and Mexico, and two goods, cars and avocados. This table shows you how much labor it takes, how many hours of work it takes to produce a car and an avocado. So in the US, a car takes 10 hours to produce, and it takes 5 hours to make an avocado. In Mexico, it takes 12 hours to produce a car and 3 hours to produce an avocado. So in a world without trade, the US would produce some amount of cars and some amount of avocados, and the same in Mexico. But they have different sort of areas of efficiency, what we'll call comparative advantage in a minute. So when we think about who could be better at producing a car, we want to think about opportunity cost. So in the US, to produce one additional car means that we would have to give up 2 avocados, right? We would take that 10 hours and make a car, and that means that we would have 2 fewer avocados. So the opportunity cost of one car in the US is 2 avocados. In Mexico, to produce one car, they would have to give up 4 avocados, right? Because they would have to reallocate 4 avocados worth of labor to produce that car. And in the US, 1 avocado means that you give up half a car. And in Mexico, 1 avocado means that you give up a quarter of a car. And so when we think about who is more efficient at producing cars and avocados, we look at who has the lowest opportunity cost, right? So in the US, they have a lower opportunity cost of producing cars, and Mexico has a lower opportunity cost of producing avocados. And so what this means is that the US should specialize in cars, and Mexico should specialize in avocados. What happens when we specialize? And here's the key intuition, right? Trade expands the pie, because if countries do what they do best, they use resources more efficiently. So the US is relatively more efficient at producing cars, and Mexico is relatively more efficient at making avocados. That means that if the US took all of its labor and made cars, and Mexico took all of its labor and made avocados, we would have more of both. And then countries could engage in trade, right? So this is the key idea of comparative advantage, which you might hear a lot about, because it's really a driving force behind why trade is good. And in a moment, we'll talk about sort of the who benefits from and who is hurt by trade within countries. So key idea here is that trade expands the pie, right? Both sides gain from trade because both sides can consume more than they can produce in a world of autarky, in a world of no trade. And that's the last bit of economic theory that I'm going to share. And so this idea, this like very powerful but simple idea, motivates why there has traditionally been a very high level of consensus, a very deep belief in free trade among economists. So, this is survey data, something like, 90% of economists surveyed in 1992 thought free trade was good. In 2009, even, 83% of economists surveyed thought that completely unfettered, just meaning completely open markets, would be good. So this is the sort of key idea driving that, right? Because it's about efficiency and increasing the possibility of production. So if trade makes nations better off, why is there a backlash? Because even though the pie gets bigger, it's not sliced evenly, and some pieces get even smaller, right? So there is this component where the country as a whole is better off, but some groups in society are in relative terms or in absolute terms worse off, right? And so if you think about that toy example that we were just talking about, in the US, car makers benefit in a world where they export cars to Mexico, and avocado growers in the United States are hurt by the fact that imports of avocados come from Mexico. So this is the sort of key essential point about why trade is political. It's because there are winners and losers from trade. And I'm going to focus my talk on sort of like within countries, right? We could have a whole conversation around sort of who benefits more in relative terms from trade between countries. And we'll talk a bit about that toward the end of the talk. But a key point here is that there are winners and losers from trade. Exporting industries grow, and that means that jobs are created, wages go up, Capital in those industries say that factory owners benefit from higher prices and greater demand for their products. On the other hand, import competing industries are harmed. They face job loss, wages go down. Some capital owners, those factory owners or firms, they shrink or exit the market, right? Consumers benefit from cheaper prices and more variety. So we have some winners and some losers from trade. We often focus on the losers from trade because they are so politically important. But a point that I will try to emphasize throughout the talk is that trade supports many jobs in the United States. And so we do want to be sort of attentive to that when we think about, what is the impact of tariffs on jobs in the United States. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but I do want to emphasize that we can think about winners and losers from trade, what political scientists like me would call distributional conflict. The fight about the distribution of gains. We can think about this along a variety of dimensions. And one of the really key ones is sort of around factors. The idea being that owners of abundant factors win when a country opens up to trade, and owners of scarce factors lose. And so in the United States, we are thought of as a capital abundant, right? We're a rich country, we're capital abundant, and we are abundant in skilled labor. We are less abundant, we are scarce in less skilled labor, right? So when we think about who's benefited from trade, we can think about sort of capital owners and skilled labor benefiting, and less skilled labor being harmed by trade competition. Industries that use abundant factors, so industries that are capital and skill intensive, tend to benefit. Industries using scarce factors tend to lose. And so if you think about steel, if you think about textiles, right? If you think about furniture production, those are industries that have really been negatively affected by trade in the United States. I'll come back to thinking about occupations and communities in a bit, right? But this is all just to say there are many different ways to understand who benefits from and who is harmed by trade. All of this is essential because to understand trade politics, we have to think about who benefits and who is harmed, and then ask, okay, what are their partisan preferences? Which parties do they support? What policies do they like? And how does this affect their political behavior? All right, so that's the end of the economic theory. And we can move into this sort of trade politics piece, right? Which is really, pretty, very interesting piece of this. So generally speaking, Americans are supportive of free trade. We don't have great time series data, meaning data over time on support for free trade. But here, this is a Gallup poll that asks, what do you think foreign trade means for America? Do you see foreign trade as an opportunity for economic growth through exports? That's this light green line. Or do you see it as a threat to the economy from foreign imports? That's the dark green line. And Gallup stopped asking this question. Gallup has sort of asked this question sporadically over time. But what you see, especially starting in 2012, is an increase actually in the share of Americans that thought foreign trade is beneficial versus a threat to the economy. And that might seem like a disconnect between the rhetoric that we hear today and the politics of today. But again, we have to remember that in addition to consumers, many jobs are directly or indirectly supported by economic globalization. Right? So overall, Americans are supportive. Why then does trade create political conflict? Because those benefits are dispersed, right? The benefits to each of us as consumers from trade are meaningful, but small and diffuse, spread across the country compared to very significant and concentrated losses due to trade. And so, my little graph here just meant to show that like the benefits are spread around, but the factories close, the communities and the workers that are negatively affected by trade are very concentrated. And so in a world where politicians want to be elected, they respond to, and we can talk more about the US political system in the Q&A if there's questions, right? But politicians respond to that sort of concentrated pain with protectionism. And so one form, and like the very timely and salient form of trade protectionism that we see today is tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on imports, and we're going to look at variation in US tariff rates over time. But the thing I'll mention, and the thing that you may have heard as you follow the news on this, is that economically tariffs are inefficient. They actually like reduce the amount of production and consumption that can happen, and they really hurt consumers, right? So as consumers, when we buy something that has a tariff, that tariff is a tax, right? And so there are costs to this, right? As consumers, we lose our benefit from free trade, but we are spread out and diffuse compared to very concentrated losses in certain communities. And so understanding the winners and losers helps us explain popular and elite support for tariffs, for trade wars, and to think about sort of polarization as well. So you might be wondering, like, if trade is so good, why can't we just help or compensate the people that are hurt by trade? And so very briefly, if we think about trade liberalization creates winners and losers, what if we had compensation programs like trade adjustment assistance, or which is a program in the United States that was very was the predominant program helping workers negatively affected by trade, although that lapsed in 2019, I think. Or what if we had an unemployment insurance or job retraining, et cetera, to help workers hurt by trade? And then that would allow us to maintain support for openness, right? So if you help people negatively affected by trade transition to new jobs, maybe that can generate support for openness. And that allows governments to protect the workers that need protection while maintaining the benefits of economic openness, greater efficiency, economic growth, more consumption, et cetera. And that idea was the foundation of sort of the liberal international order post-World War II. Without that compensation, an open economic system is really not sustainable. And so that worked for a time, but a couple of things have happened in the United States since the end of World War II. There's been a shift in policy to emphasize efficiency. At the same time, there has been less role for government, less compensation. So this liberalization progressed without a corresponding increase in social investment. We also had sort of geographic concentration of persistent job loss. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. In addition to sort of like massive structural change starting in the 1990s that includes not only trade and offshoring, but also automation. And this has really fueled inequality on a variety of dimensions, declining standards of living for many, resentment, et cetera. So now we get to the sort of like part about jobs. What about jobs? The decline in manufacturing employment has been a key driver of trade politics. And so on the top level here, we have manufacturing employment in the United States from 1990 through 2025. And on the bottom, we have manufacturing output or industrial production from 1990 to 2025. And what you can see is that, the US, which faces a lot of competition from manufactured imports, because they tend to be relatively less skill intensive than the things that the United States exports. in combination with sort of offshoring, what we see is that manufacturing employment went down, even as manufacturing output increased or stayed the same, right? So in this early period of 1990 to 2000, we have continued liberalization, continued opening up, manufacturing employment is going up, manufacturing output is going up, employment is steady. And then really this key moment in 2000, which we'll talk about as sort of like the entry of China into the global economy, you see just a massive decrease in manufacturing employment in the United States that has never fully rebounded, even as sort of output has continued to stay relatively high, right? So there's this disconnect between output and employment. So we have this very concentrated and persistent effect of import competition. So this is a really famous paper called the China Shock paper. It was published by economists in 2013. And what it showed was that areas exposed to import competition from China faced sort of substantial negative labor market effects. And so what I want to show on the left here is that import competition, the darker colors, right, are associated with plant closures, decline in manufacturing, decline in wages, especially for lower skill workers, decline in housing prices, decline in tax revenue. So like a whole body of work has focused on this China shock. Variation, there's been associated with a variety of social problems, including what's become known as the deaths of despair. Places that saw this deindustrialization have experienced increasing mortality due to drug and alcohol use, declining marriage rates, a whole variety of economic and social problems. And these effects have persisted. The sort of peak China shock, like in terms of imports, is from 2000 to sort of early 2010s, but these negative effects have persisted, right? There has not been adjustment in the way that economic theory would have predicted, right? People didn't find new jobs in the way that like economic theory would have said, okay, if you lose your job due to import competition, you move to a non-traded or, sort of export-oriented sector. And that just hasn't happened for a variety of reasons I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Very quickly, beyond manufacturing, and I think for students, this is like interesting and important to think about. There have been significant changes in labor markets. And so this is data on employment share by occupation. And I'll just point out quickly sort of a couple of things. And this is like very long run data. But here sort of, even starting in the 1960s, you start to see a decline in blue collar, or what we would consider sort of like manufacturing and similar jobs, declining, a rise in professional occupations as a share of total employment. And here, I just want to like draw your attention to sort of another aspect of the decline in sort of middle skill, middle income jobs in the United States, which has been the sort of decline in employment of office and administrative work. And that's largely due to technological change, right? That has made things like bookkeeping or other kinds of tasks sort of fall off a little bit. So we've seen big changes in the labor market. This has like driven something that I think gets a lot of attention, this idea of job polarization. And so in the United States, and this is from the same paper that I just showed, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, in the 2000s, and in the 2010s, what we saw was decreasing employment in these middle skill jobs. That's this sort of like bright blue bar. We see a decrease in middle skill employment opportunities. And especially in the 90s, 2000s, 2010, we see that that's happening as employment in low skill jobs goes up and employment in high skill jobs goes up. So that's this like hollowing out of the labor market, the decline of pathways to the middle class for middle skill workers. The authors of this paper like kind of point out that in the most recent period, 2016 forward, you actually see only a growth in high skill occupations and a decline in others. So a little bit of a shift there. But this idea that there are fewer pathways to the middle class, especially for non-college educated workers, is like really the driving force that has had like very significant political consequences, fueling a backlash against globalization, including immigration, which again, happy to talk about in the Q&A, and increasing support for far right and right populist parties across the advanced economies, right? So the US, while it's unique in some ways, is sort of following a pattern that we see across many countries. So what does this all mean for US trade policy, right? We've talked about sort of these massive changes in the labor market. How has that changed and how does that drive US trade policy? And I apologize, I imagine that this figure is maybe a little bit hard to see, but this is just sort of US average effective tariff rates from like the 1900s when they were really high through the present. And I'll just point out that, sort of there's this period of up and down liberalization before World War I. Then you see this sort of like spike in the interwar period. And there's this Smoot-Hawley tariff, which is like the most famous tariff act in US history because it raised tariffs on, thousands of imported goods, deepening the Great Recession, the Great Depression, and sparking a wave of global retaliation. So this is the original trade war, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and the way that countries responded to that. Then a really important thing happens post World War II. Under the leadership of the United States, there is this General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, known as GATT, which becomes the sort of multilateral framework that is used to liberalize trade. It eventually turns into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And then, we have in the 90s, we have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, plus the establishment of the WTO. And then just here to give you a sense, like how much, we expect tariffs to go up under Trump's second administration. So we are in sort of unprecedented territory for recent history in terms of like where we have landed with tariffs today. And if you zoom in into like what I think of as sort of like the present 1990 forward, you can see this is this data goes like sort of pre-Trump 2.0, but for many decades, trade in the United States was not political at sort of like the elite level. Both parties supported free trade. Democrats a little bit less so, especially when you think about things like NAFTA. In 2001, China joins the WTO, sort of sparking this massive increase in imports, which is like then blamed for like massive manufacturing job loss that I showed you. In the 2010s, you start to see more mainstream concern, especially among Democrats, about fair trade. And then with the entry of Trump into sort of the political mainstream, we see sort of this mainstream protectionist sentiment and populism. And now, like, that has led us to where we are, which is a rethinking of what we mean by free trade. So one thing I'll just mention is like super, super briefly, because I want to make sure that we get to some other things, is that like what you can't see on the previous slide is that during this window when it doesn't look like much is happening with tariffs, there's huge movement in other areas of policy that drive trade liberalization forward. So we have, in particular, free trade agreements that shape intellectual property, investment, labor and environmental standards. And so, there are many other tools of trade policy beside tariffs that are being used during this sort of pre-Trump 1.0 era. The realignment on trade in the United States, I think in terms of partisanship, we really can't overstate how significant that is. In terms of sort of party elites, definitely it was always Democrats that were more skeptical of the benefits of trade, especially those with large labor constituencies, and Republicans traditionally more free market, more liberal trade. Voters a little bit more, a little bit less of a difference. And so this is the view that NAFTA has been good for the US by party. They asked this question in about 2004, and then they didn't ask this question again until 2017, again, because of Trump's entry into mainstream politics. And what you see is this huge increase in the percent of Democrats that thought NAFTA has been good, and the decline in the percent of Republicans that think NAFTA is good, right? So there's really been this big shift in sort of partisanship where Democrats are now more pro-trade than Republicans, right? So that's sort of the background of the evolution of U.S. trade policy up until what I view as sort of a regime break, right? Trump 1.0 is really the end of the conversation around free trade as we understood it for decades, right? And so there are now some, or let me say, I shouldn't say there are now. There are some similarities between President Trump 1.0 and 2.0 and President Biden's administration. We saw a shift in emphasis and sort of some shared priorities between both administrations, right? Discussions around supply chain resilience. This comes both from the pandemic, where in the US, we couldn't get protective equipment. We couldn't get some basic, not very technical products because we no longer made them at home, right? So another area where supply chain resilience is really coming into play is when we talk about critical minerals. And so if you've heard anything about sort of China, one of the ways in which China has responded during the trade war, this most recent sort of escalation during Trump's second administration, has been to say that they will put export restrictions on critical minerals. Critical minerals are the foundation of batteries, of semiconductors, of so many things that we rely on. And China really does have a chokehold on a lot of the stockpile and processing of these critical minerals. So thinking about supply chain resilience is something that has happened under both Democratic and Republican administrations. A focus on the nature of unfair competition from China, and I'm happy to say more about what exactly that unfair competition has looked like if there's interest. But it's not just around sort of access to Chinese markets, but exchange rates, subsidies, technological theft, and other things. And a really big support for US manufacturing and the idea that we can bring jobs back to the United States. So those are shared priorities, ever since 2016. Some very different, very big differences in terms of how Biden and Trump think about and approach this. So Trump has very much, especially in the second term, taken a broad confrontational approach, imposing tariffs on allies and adversaries alike, whereas Biden was much more targeted and involved a lot more coordination with allies. So countries like China, or excuse me, not China, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, etc., the EU. And this really comes down to a difference, I think, in trade philosophy. Trump, it seems, really sees trade as a zero-sum competition, right? So he does not focus on the mutual gains from trade, but really sees it as like a winner-loser between country thing. And I'll talk more about that in just a second when I talk about the trade deficit, right? The tools and authority that they use are quite different as well. And I'll talk more about sort of that here in a moment, right? So just want to emphasize that like on the left-hand side, there are like very legitimate shared concerns about the nature of US integration in the global economy and whether, especially since, you know, the mid 2010s, whether we have gone so far in favor of efficiency that we have lost sight of other things that really matter, including supply chain resilience, support for US manufacturing and US workers, the implications that all of these things have for national security. Okay. I've got 5 minutes left and a handful of slides. I'll try to get through them quickly. So one thing that President Trump focuses a lot on and is the deficit. He cares very deeply about the trade deficit. What I'm showing you here is the deficit of exports and services. So the US runs a trade deficit overall. We import more goods than we export. We do run a surplus in services. So we export more services than we import, but our overall trade deficit is negative, has been that way since the mid 1970s. Although, you know, it has increased in scope or as a share of our GDP, right? And so is the trade deficit something that we should care about? I mean, you know, is it a national security concern? Some in the Trump administration have argued that it is a national security concern because we, you know, have to borrow money to cover this, and that makes us vulnerable. It has been viewed as evidence of unfair competition, right? So although we have an overall trade deficit, we have, you know, bilateral surpluses with some countries and deficits with others. Where there is a deficit, is that evidence of unfair competition? I would say sometimes yes and sometimes no, of course. So that, but this is really an important like thing that, in addition to discussions around America first, make it in America kinds of policies related to jobs, this is another key thing that seems to drive Trump's trade policy in the second administration. So tariffs are definitely the tool of choice. He has used laws in sort of like unprecedented ways. And the big one that I'll mention, because national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, he used those in the first term. They were continued by Biden. Section 301, retaliation against unfair practices, this targeting China specifically because of unfair trade practices. That's sort of been used quite frequently throughout time. The real change and the very unprecedented and challenged piece is the use of the Emergency Powers Act to levy tariffs. Traditionally, it was used to like restrict tech exports or to address investment. But this idea, these reciprocal tariffs that the Trump administration has put in place are being challenged in the courts. And so the case is currently at the Supreme Court, and there is this question of whether all of these tariffs will survive at the Supreme Court, right? Because it's been challenged. This law, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not include any mention of tariffs or taxes or anything like that at all. So there's a question in the argument by the plaintiffs is that the Trump administration has overreached. I'll just mention that today there was a vote in the Senate to repeal Trump's tariffs on Brazil. He recently levied 50% tariff on Brazil, a country that we have a surplus with, because he was protesting the impeachment and pending prison sentence of Jair Bolsonaro, who's a Trump ally and friend. So a lot of these sort of tariffs, especially in the bottom category, are being contested, right? And so there's just tremendous uncertainty about what the policies will be. And, like to the extent to which this violates WTO rules is another thing that we could talk about. So just to show very broadly, this is how Trump's tariffs have impacted adversaries and allies alike. And so just to wrap up, and I might just go like a couple of minutes over, I apologize. Can tariffs support the creation of better jobs? So, in a world where manufacturing employment has declined, where pathways to the middle class are shrinking, are tariffs a tool that can be used to support the creation of better jobs? And I would argue that this is really difficult to do in a world of global production and automation. And so here I'm just showing like US industrial robot stock increasing over time. I'll skip that slide in the interest of time and just make the following points. In the face of higher trade costs, firms have incentives to automate. And so when they move production back on shore, those reshored jobs are more automated, right? And what that means is that those new jobs created are different than the ones that were lost. The tasks of displaced workers and those created by new jobs are dissimilar, even within manufacturing. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second here, right? They have different skills that are required, and they might be located in completely different geographies than those communities that were previously negatively affected, right? And so that makes it very difficult for tariffs to help communities and workers left behind by those changes in production without very targeted non-trade policies. And so I'll just like very quickly show occupations, I think, are one of the most important ways to think about who benefits from and who is harmed by global production and even technological change. So traditional manufacturing jobs include sort of assembly, reading blueprints, operating tools, requires hand-eye coordination, etc. New manufacturing jobs include things like robotics technicians, right? The people that build, install, program the robots, right? And that uses a variety of different skills and has a variety of different sort of educational requirements that are needed, right? And so, it's really about the type of work that you do in your job that explains whether you benefit from or are harmed by these changes in production. So in addition to the challenge of creating jobs, trade wars lead to retaliation, and that can actually negatively affect US workers and companies that rely on trade. And so China is one country that has really sort of retaliated in a tit for tat manner. Although, in the last couple of days, we're hearing that there might be a new framework in place to reduce these trade tensions. I'll skip this slide. I'll say sort of, I have 2 slides left. I'll just say that the evidence to date have these policies been effective at bringing manufacturing back, it's really too soon to say, right? What we have seen, though, is sort of a leveling off of construction of factories. Many have been announced, but it's not clear that like the announcement of some big projects is going to offset sort of a flattening. Like, we just don't know yet. But uncertainty really seems to be curtailing business activity and business investment. And so this graph, I think, is really powerful. It shows the 1-year change in manufacturing jobs by industry from last July to this July. And you see decreases in employment in semiconductors, a place where we're supposed to be seeing focused investment, in motor vehicle parts, in aerospace, in sort of like other really like important consequential manufacturing sectors, right? And it's not necessarily that these folks are laying people off yet. They're just not filling empty positions. So to summarize, tariffs have unintended but not unanticipated consequences. Higher input costs mean that firms that rely on imported parts become less competitive and they grow more slowly. Retaliation hurts exporters. And there is a consumer impact. And we haven't talked much about this, but higher prices on everyday goods disproportionately affect low-income households. So in my view, we need an economy that works better for more Americans, but protectionist trade policy alone is unlikely to benefit manufacturing workers and in fact could cause harm. So I know I went a little bit over time and I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we can take some questions now. Any questions? Go ahead, Bernardo.
Hey, so you mentioned how politics play a role in trade. And given the current government shutdown, how do you think it's affecting U.S. trade, especially like our ability to manage and compete in global trade?
Great question. I mean, I think in some sense, the administration seems to be moving forward like on a diplomatic level to try and create these trade deals. So that activity is still happening. In other ways, it's hurting our ability to compete, because one area where the government shutdown is affecting business decisions is that we don't have any data. And so like data that businesses use to make investment decisions is missing. I think that's one piece of it. The impact of like the federal shutdown and workers who are like furloughed and not getting paid is a negative, like a really significant negative effect on local economies. And so I think that that's also probably hurting our overall economic situation. The long-term effect on like our ability to compete, less clear, right? I think the extent to which we don't engage in research and development, the extent to which we don't share data is one aspect to consider. But I guess we'll know more if the shutdown continues, which hopefully it doesn't. Oh, sorry, should I?
Sure, you can just go ahead and call names if you want.
Do you want me to call, or I wasn't sure
So
if you were going to?
I'll call. They're in order anyway. So Rob is next.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Erica. Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I used to teach in the honors program, an economics course. So my question has to do with the revenue raising aspect. There's a lot of conflicts in Trump's policies, and of course it's very erratic from one day to the next. But if it's effective in that China, for example, lowers its prices to maintain the same price, then in fact they're paying it. But it doesn't look like that's happening. It looks like U.S. consumers are paying it. And then, of course, if it does block trade, then we're not going to be raising the revenue. But it does appear to be raising quite a bit of revenue. And so I'm wondering if how you see this panning out as sort of his trade policies settle out in terms of revenue raising, and if effectively it is a way of imposing a sales tax. You know, we could never do that politically in this country, and we don't have a national sales tax, you know, because you've got the huge fiscal budget deficits. And so that's sort of what I'm interested in, you know, and again, of course, that you know, it's sort of a regressive tax at that, you know, if it is a sales tax. So I'll give you some openings on that.
Yeah, sure. Let me try to answer that briefly. I mean, I think you've hit on to me what is the key point here, that a tariff is a very regressive tax, and so the burden on low and middle income families is much more significant. Will it raise more revenue? Like it is a feature of the budget plan, right, to raise revenue in this way. My own view, and I think the view of many, is that the cost in terms of economic slowdown will be greater than the revenue that is raised. But yeah, I mean, it is definitely a way to generate revenue, but again, in a way that is just like horrifically regressive.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is on something that I had read about the importing. A lot of times imported goods are not necessarily the goods that are needed. So a lot of places are like importing potatoes. What is that? Can I just
So I don't know if that was the full question, Flo, but I mean, I think most imports are driven by like a market mechanism. So I don't know, like I'm not familiar with the idea that like imports are necessarily like not what's needed. And actually this does prompt me to mention something that I wanted to raise in response to the previous question, which is the role of multinational firms and businesses in shaping this. You know, to some extent, like we haven't seen as much inflation yet from the effect of these tariffs, because multinational firms are somewhat absorbing it or pushing it back onto their suppliers. But I think like an important point here is just that like multinational firms are a really big driver, both of like what is imported and, you know, like the impact and the extent to which like consumers feel the squeeze from these tariffs. I sort of expect that to go to the impact on consumers to rise as this goes on.
Thank you. Kaylin, you're next.
Hi, I just want to thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. But my question is just in regards to sort of the beginning when you were talking, I think about economic theory. And I just wanted a little bit of clarification. So besides compensation, is there any way to make sure that it isn't just winners and losers where jobs aren't lost to trade? Or is it something that's inevitable and kind of essential to trade and trade politics?
Great question. And is it possible, like I would love to share my slides if anyone's interested, because I have a couple of book recommendations at the end, just like about some of this. So some like accessible, great books that I really recommend. But to your point, yes, I think the idea of creative destruction is key to like what has to happen when we open up to trade. There are some sectors that are non-tradable, and so we would sort of view them as not being affected by trade, although they benefit from trade as consumers. So, I mean, I think the key thing here is that economic theory said that there should be adjustment, but a lot of economic models assume, and in economic models that informed U.S. trade policy for decades, assumed full employment. And so I think the U.S. policymakers didn't really appreciate or understand how long and slow and painful the process would be. You know, like like the areas that are growing from trade are different than the areas that are hurt by trade. And sometimes people can't move to those, you know, growing areas for a variety of reasons. And so I think it's a feature of the thing. But the extent to which like reallocation didn't happen and adjustment didn't happen is, I think, why we are where we are today.
Hello, I'm sorry about that. So, how do you, oh, should I leave it unmuted or?
You're okay, I think.
Okay. So, how do you think globalization affects trade? And if we were a sheltered society who only sold like the things we specialized in, like you said, like we specialize in cars in America, then do you think it would be better for the economy and the winners and losers?
Great question. So I think in many respects, like US standards of living are much higher than they were before. And a lot of that is due to trade, right? Like even families that are relatively low income have access to refrigerators, washers, dryers, cars, electronics, and such. So in many ways, like we are better off. And I think really the question is, how do we make globalization work better for more workers? And the answer to this, I think, is it's really complicated because firms have so many ways that they can like respond to increasing labor costs. And so I think, there's a lot we're doing that we should be doing in the non-trade space to preserve the benefits of trade that I do see. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic.
I really liked your presentation, and the question I had is, I know you mentioned a lot about how politics influence trade, and repeating myself, my question is, how do you view the ongoing tax and trade issues between Trump and Biden, and why do you think Biden's getting most of the blame, even though you mentioned Trump most of the time?
Great. I mean, I think so in terms of like, I mean, I'm trying to think here. Okay. So I think like in terms of Biden's trade policies, he didn't shift that much from Trump 1.0. But what he did experience was like a massive increase in inflation, partly as a result of the pandemic and things outside of his control. And so I think that was really hard to come back from. I think some of the other policies that the Biden administration pursued, like namely what we would call industrial policy. So if you've heard of the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, some of that was like investing in semiconductors and other things that the Trump administration is doing. But some of it was also surrounding climate change and things like that. So I think you had a combination of like a macroeconomic force, inflation, which was very real and somewhat beyond the control, I think, of the Biden administration to address, leading to this sort of concern. And, again, sort of, I mean, we are talking about like sort of decades of policymakers and political parties being very cavalier about the effects of trade on certain communities. I hope that answers your question.
Hi. Sorry.
You may want to mute and type in your question instead.
I think, this maybe mute.
Yeah, mute and type. In the meantime, as you're typing, we're going to take Martha's question.
In a world of growing tariffs and trade wars, do you believe international collaboration is something that will survive?
Oh, great question. So I didn't really get the chance to talk. As you could probably tell, it was very hard for me to condense my talk into 45 and what ended up being 50 minutes. So this is a great question, though. Like, what is the future of international collaboration? I think certainly the current administration is not interested in engaging in sort of multilateral cooperation. They are pursuing a very unilateral strategy that I think undermines and makes it difficult for other countries to, one, trust the United States as a trade partner, and two, it creates space for other countries to engage in the same kind of protectionist, sort of nationalistic policy. I will say we have seen many other countries led by the EU and some others try to rally around the WTO and like create other spaces that don't include the United States to try and maintain some of those benefits from global cooperation. So I think, in short, if you had to, if pressed, I would say I expect cooperation to continue. It might look different and it might not include the United States, which I think is to a detriment to the United States.
Great, thank you. And we have the question in chat. Do you think there
Yeah.
will be some kind of hope in trade according to how things are now?
Yeah, I think, and I think I might link this to the previous question. Like, what do I think like we can expect? I mean, based on sort of like what kind of economic activity can benefit American workers or change our values. I think this comes down to a variety of other policies that don't relate to trade specifically. I'm a little bit pessimistic, honestly, about where we're headed under the current administration, because I think a real problem is that companies have too much power relative to workers. And so what I see as like an important path forward is policies that support and train workers and increase their bargaining power. And to me, that is what we need in order to help create good jobs that benefit many workers. And so I'm pretty skeptical that like we're headed in a good direction with all the tariffs, but maybe I'll be proved wrong. But I think it's a broader structural thing that we need to have happen with our economy to influence our politics and get us to a place where, politics is more focused on the benefits from cooperation. Yeah, someone said unions. I think unions are important. I think tax policy is really important because companies have a variety of ways to reduce their labor costs, to reduce their tax burdens, and that deprives all of us of things that we could really use as families, as workers.
Thank you.
And-
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Morgan, did you want to say your question, or did you want us to read it? Oh, okay. Okay. All right, go ahead.
You're unmuted. Okay. My question was, how has the shutdown of the government affected the trade?
Right. Yeah, I think this relates to an earlier question. I think so far, sort of Trump is on a trip to Asia right now, and he seems to be making progress on negotiating trade deals. But I think, the economic slowdown that happens, the cost that we have due to not just like lack of data, but sort of uncertainty around U.S. Trustworthiness, U.S. credibility, negatively affects like our business climate overall. And I'll link this to a question that I see in the chat about when tariffs increase suddenly. A really big issue, I think, is the uncertainty around what will happen, right? We have uncertainty around the federal shutdown, when it will end. We have uncertainty around what future tariffs will be. And that makes it really hard for businesses to decide what to do. They might wait to hire workers. They might wait to invest and just sort of scale back and wait and see. And all of those things are not good for sort of US economic growth or indeed global economic growth.
Perfect. So we have one question left. I think, Catherine, your question, you want to?
Yeah. I wanted to say thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting, and learning about politics and trade a little bit more deeply, something that I've been interested in, meaning to do my own research on. But most people had some great questions that have already been answered, but one question that I have had for a while, and I saw something a while back on, I thought you might have some information on. I remember reading an article about how, because of how much we import from China, and how great that is in comparison to what we export. We have like a huge surplus in California of shipping containers that are like just stacking up and we don't know what to do with them. And I didn't know if you knew anything about how we would get rid of those shipping containers to like send back, but I guess like we will never basically send them out enough and we're just collecting all these shipping containers. I don't know if you knew anything about that.
I haven't heard anything about that, but that's like a pretty interesting problem. I did just hear that China has agreed to purchase some soybeans. This has been like a really hot button issue with the trade war in terms of what we export to China. So maybe some of those containers can be used for soybeans. But no, I think like the decline in activity at ports it hurts workers who like are like sort of longshore workers, but I don't know about that. That's an interesting thing. I'll have to Google that later. And then I know we're at time. One other person did ask in the chat about exchange rates. Exchange rates are really important. They shape how much we trade, and the imposition of tariffs. I won't say it's because of this, but the U.S. dollar is weaker lately, and I think that's partly due to everything that's happening in the U.S. Right, so that makes it more expensive for us to buy things from abroad, and that naturally decreases our imports.
Great, thank you. And we have 2 more questions. Korea, you're next. I guess not.
Oh,
Okay, sure, go ahead.
I had a quick question. So,
Sure.
what are the long-term effects of trade on income inequality within or in between countries, and what policies or policy intervention could
Yes,
mitigate
Yes,
these
Sandra,
effects?
that's it. Questions.
Good.
I have your name.
Oh, great question. So I think an important point here is that trade has made many countries better off, but some have gotten a lot better off. And so there's a whole body of research, and I think a whole world of like activity or like led by a lot of the BRIC countries, the emerging markets, to say, hey, like we want to benefit from trade in ways that like the current system doesn't allow us to do, right? So policies like reforms and trade policy in the advanced economies are key things that in the 30 seconds, that's what I would say, is that's a really huge area of activity and research that's really important to try and understand. And it shapes what and how much cooperation there will be in the future, for sure.
Thank you. And we have 1 remaining question, FN Sub. Am I saying that name correctly?
Hi, I'm called Freda.
Okay, okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I just have one question. How is this trade affecting the economy of developing countries? I'm from Uganda, so I just want to know how it's affecting the developing countries. Yeah.
I think this is a very concerning situation for developing countries. And I'll just say, like, some of my own recent work has looked at how US companies moving factories back to the US and automating is reducing demand for products from Mexico. And so it's causing a negative labor market shock in Mexico. And so I think it's the similar kind of situation. The more like closely linked you are to the US, the more you will be negatively affected by incentives that companies have to reduce their trade behavior. And so I think it's very concerning for developing countries and the extent to which they have previously relied on manufacturing and other trade as a way of sort of moving up in terms of income levels.
Thank you. We have Tafara waiting.
Hi. My question is more on the political side, but you can give me the economic implication. So, I read somewhere where it was saying that the way the US has been handling the economy of late is very like imperialistic and bulldozing around. Uh, and usually when you see, looking at history, when kingdoms start to do that, it's like a sign of desperation to hold the power since China is emerging and moving fast. What is your view on that?
Great question, and a really big one. I think to me, the international trading system has been a huge benefit to the United States in terms of its global status, its soft power, its role as a leader in the world. So I do think that like the retreat from that is something that will change the US's position in the world. I'm not sure that that's something that is of concern to the Trump administration, right? They seem to they have a different worldview, right? And so I think they see it differently. But I agree that I think like if I look back over history, it would be concerning to me.
Thank you. We have Nurai waiting in line.
Okay, should I read?
Yeah, you can read.
Okay. Yeah, talking about the Trump's tariffs. So I want to ask something about.
When you have your thing unmuted, you can come and ask.
Should I unmute?
Yeah, just come here and ask your question. Okay.
Yeah. While American industries is dependent on foreign out. Oh my God, just I need to go.
Okay, we'll wait for you. Jimmy has a question. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for taking your time. I had a question. I've been in the manufacturing business for about 10 years now. It's a business at high demand. It's with automotive parts. And I've never seen a slowdown like such as the one we're having now. And it started when the tariffs were happening. We were working 5 days, 60 hours a week. Now we're working 4 days. And I'm loving it. I'm not gonna complain. It's allowed me to come back to school. And I just was wondering if, I know it's hard to predict when things will end or when things will with the business of things. I was wondering if you could predict, or if you have like a prediction of when things might pick up again, or when these tariffs might like go back to, I don't know, to the standard level.
Yeah, I think like that's a great point, right? Like I brushed past that on the slide, but like I think for companies that, you know, like especially smaller and medium-sized companies, right? Like these tariffs are a huge impact. I think to me, like what happens at the Supreme Court is going to be really important. And then I think unfortunately it's just going to take a lot of pain, right? For in particular Republican legislators to say, okay, like the power of tariffs rests with Congress, and Congress can take that back. And so I think if the level of pain is enough, the level of slowdown and pain to constituents, especially in Republican districts, that will be what I see as something that could change. I think right now the idea is like in the short run, there's going to be like a lot of pain, but in the long term, there's gain. It's a question of, you know, like I don't see that gain in the future, but if you do, it's a question of how long you're willing to wait and like the cost that you're willing to pay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And one last question.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. I think it's okay now. So about the Trump tariffs, I just wonder, while American industry is dependent on foreign output and cheap labor, how Republican Party's tariff policy aim to address this issue? And since they are strongly opposed to immigration, how they plan to utilize domestic labor resources in terms of supply chain and workforce?
This is a great idea. I mean, I have thoughts about this. I mean, I basically think that they don't have, like, just specifically on the topic of immigration, that they don't have a policy in place that is going to resolve the labor shortage that they have created through their immigration enforcement, because the jobs often held by immigrant workers are not jobs that U.S. citizens will do. And so, you know, I think the answer is that they don't have a policy, and that, frankly, their plan is to that the immigration enforcement is not to address real economic issues in our country. It's to address a political position which says, like, we will cut down on immigration. And so I think it's a politically motivated policy that is flawed economically. And I don't know that they are bothered by that. That's what it seems to me.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you
I mean,
so
like,
much.
yeah, sorry.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm amazed the level of engagement from students and the wonderful
Me too.
questions had, right? So it means this was a very powerful presentation. Thank you, Erica, so much. This was great. Everyone, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you for participating, and we'll see you in our next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Olsun, oldu sonunda.
Evet.